today we're very excited to welcome Ms. Miranda Lowe, who is the Principal Curator at the Natural History Museum in London. So not only is she an expert in museum curation, but she also has particular scientific expertise in crustacea and coral taxonomy. And besides her work at the museum, Miranda is also an active scientific communicator, appearing in various BBC shows to speak about both curatorial research and popular science. In today's talk, she will be lecturing about decolonizing natural history collections and the importance of doing so to create a more inclusive narrative of our natural history, as well as to foster a more inclusive museum sector. So let's put our hands together to welcome her.
There we go. Can you all hear me? Brilliant. Right. Welcome everyone. I'm just going, some of you may have read the abstract for my talk already, but I'm going to read it again because it gives a great kind of context, opening context to what I'm going to talk about today. So, decolonising natural history collections and related knowledge requires tracing how specimens and objects were collected, acquired and moved worldwide, as well as acknowledging the labour and contribution of Black, Indigenous and people of colour in the process. It reveals the influence of local or Indigenous knowledge and its subsequent suppression. These narratives were commonly absent from the interpretation of natural history collections, particularly in relation to colonial histories, which will be explored in my talk. The misrepresentation of the past is problematic because it alienates non-white audiences. Acknowledging difficult pasts is an important first step in creating a more inclusive and representative interpretation across the natural history and the museum sector. So, this has become my most favourite slide in talking about decolonial perspectives on perspectives and practice in terms of natural history collections and the museums that hold them. This is a painting by Jean-Baptiste Debret in the mid-1830s. It was a French artist that went to Brazil, and Brazil has just had the results of their elections, so very topical. You know, Amazon forest and everything like that, saying that. And this shows, and I love this because it shows there are people that the enslaved people in Brazil, Indigenous people in Brazil, that also were the people that gave their labour in terms of collecting natural history specimens. So in my world, and I'll discuss this a little bit more later, you're going to hear me talk a lot about specimens, but then there's going to be an element, part of it where I'm going to talk about objects and pose questions to you all, as well as later on we can have we'll have time for discussion. So I'm going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes and then questions afterwards. But in this imagery, you can see that they're collecting lots of mammals, vertebrates, invertebrates. You've got butterfly nets, you've got, and what I'm assuming is like a case to press plants, and there's an individual there collecting some of the plants too. Okay. But this just shows that there are a lot of other people that look like me that were collecting within a colonial context for many natural history museums before now. You're going to find I'm going to use a lot of R's. Now, it's not reading, writing and arithmetic. It's, the first word is reveal. So what do natural history collections reveal in terms of their colonial and colonial foundations and difficult histories? So this is where I started my deeper thinking, I would say. So before 2007, so I have been at the Natural History Museum for over 30 years. Before 2007, I was documenting lots of specimens, being allowed privileged access to go behind the scenes to see other museums' collections. And I was putting a lot of processes together, joining all the dots of the names that I was seeing and the things that I weren't seeing. Where were the silences? some of the information was hidden in plain sight, and some individual curators had chosen, for whatever reason, not to profile the information of Black and Indigenous peoples in terms of collecting natural history specimens. But I would say, since the pandemic, a lot of this has changed, this thinking, this thoughts, these processes. So here in 2007, I'll just read this little script here, for those who haven't read it already. This is the top, the front sheet of a 10-page document, a 10-chapter document, I should say, called Slavery in the Natural World, published in 2007. So 2007 marked the British bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. The Natural History Museum contributed a unique angle to the nationwide dialogue on the transatlantic slave trade. The museum itself was founded within the context of empire, colonisation and exploration, and as such there are many connections between the transatlantic slave trade and its history. Now, looking at this today, this is amazing because in the last, say, 2 to 3 years, a lot of cultural institutions, museums, art galleries have been, well, published acknowledgement statements. And I just think, at that point in 2007, the museum was really forward-thinking. It was acknowledging its colonial heritage, the way that its collections were collected. But unfortunately, so this document was created as part of that year. A lot of cultural institutions were marking the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. The Natural History Museum was working with a lot of elders from the African and Caribbean community. Myself as a member of staff, because of my cultural heritage and my professional curatorial position, I was also working with our community engagement team with these elders, looking in a different way at a lot of our natural history specimens, particularly the botanical side. The project wrapped up after a year, and what happened next wasn't great curatorial practice digitally, because this document went online but got scattered. There were a number of stories which I'm going to highlight a few to you today that resonated with me and my cultural heritage. When I went to look for this document, I could only find the first and second chapter. But luckily for me, the second chapter, there were stories within there that I really wanted to profile. But it just goes to show, and I think my museum has definitely learnt a lesson in terms of curating digital documents online. And I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but in 2018, I became friends with a new member of staff who was a woman of colour, and we were having a coffee, and she works in the public engagement digital end, and I said, oh, you're more tech savvy than me. For many years I've wanted to put this whole document together online because people need to know about this, I want to share it with people. And she was able to find the whole document, which was amazing because I'd asked many members of staff before, and for whatever reason they couldn't find them. So this was launched again over Twitter for Black History Month in 2018. People on Twitter were like, God, this is amazing, the museum's done this work before and so forth. And then some ex-colleagues from the community engagement team, they then let me know that they'd taken away with them when they left the museum hard copy of this document. More for me that I didn't even see the hard copy. I don't know, anyway, I'm in the digital world most of the time. But anyway, it's out there, and it's actually embedded in the museum website as well, so everyone can find it and it's easily. Oh yes, and I found out that it was also captured digitally via, oh gosh, I think it's the Wilberforce Institute in Hull. I might have got the full name wrong, but anyway, and so they were collating a lot of these kind of documents at that time in their own hub digitally, but I didn't know that, and that's the thing, it wasn't available anyway when I googled it. But some of you may or may have not read this paper, but from the results of my deeper thinking and research from the 2007 document, I published this paper. It was a result, actually, of a conference, a provocations conference via the Natural Sciences Association, NATSCA, and we had our conference. It's a small natural history society, and we had a conference at the Zoological Museum here in Cambridge. And so we, Subhadra Das and I, we spoke about you know, nature read in black and white, decolonial approaches to interpreting natural history. We were very, very nervous about putting forward our ideas to our community, to our peers, and we were 2 or 3 people of colour actually in a 250 strong audience as well, which does say something about at least my own community of work, that there is not much diversity, but we are looking to rectify that across that. But it was really important for Subhadra and I to kind of share these stories and these thinking, and that's what we did. And I would say this paper re-emerged when we all, you know, unfortunately we're in a pandemic, and then George Floyd was murdered, Black Lives Matter movement re-emerged again, and this paper actually came out of the paywall coincidentally, and everyone was sharing it, and I'll explain also a little bit later of other sectors that have also read this paper and applying the approaches and practices. So one of the stories that I highlight in the paper, and there is more information online at the museum's website now, but I don't know how many of you know of Hans Sloane, and you might just know of Hans Sloane in terms of the British Museum. So he is a founding father of the collections at the British Museum, and the British Museum used to house the natural history collections. They got too big for that museum. That's the reason why the South Kensington side was built. And this story about Hans Sloane resonated with me because my heritage, my parents come from the Caribbean, my father from Barbados, my mum from Grenada. And the cocoa was instrumental in my life growing up and my parents' life. But in terms of Hans Sloane, so he was very rich. He comes into it, in terms of the story with cocoa, he marries a lady called Elizabeth Rose, who owns a sugar plant, or many sugar plantations in Jamaica. Hans Sloane, a physician, well known as a botanist as well. He spent 18 months in the first instance in Jamaica. While he was there, he documented, and you can see some of the 2 volumes of books that, where he documented about the natural history of Jamaica, in particular the cocoa. He documented and observed how those enslaved Africans on the island of Jamaica were using plants and the cocoa. So for the cocoa, they were grinding the cocoa bean and boiling it with water and using it to cure kind of fever, as with most things around this time in the 1700s. Boiling anything without sugar is, you know, you hear them described in their letters and their documents about bitter tea, from but varying different plants they were using to either reduce fever or get rid of parasites. So for the cocoa, he says that, the enslaved are using the cocoa and the tea is very bitter. And he wanted to sweeten that. He said that the bitterness is no good for the stomach. And so he was the one who then decided to add sweetener, to add sugar. And I would say the rest is history, because you then get Hans Sloane popularising Hans Sloane's drinking chocolate, and you get Cadbury's, the recipes being sold. Hans Sloane had business cards around, you know, his drinking chocolate, and then it's like chocolate bars and cocoa and everything that we know of and see today. And the reason why this story resonates with me, because when I was a little girl, and my parents came from the Caribbean in the 60s and my grandparents in the 50s before that, before cocoa, cinnamon sticks, all those kind of things were available in our supermarkets, My parents' families used to send us what were known as spice parcels. And there was a cocoa in there, and my mum used to grate the cocoa bean, boil it with some water, and we'd call it cocoa tea. And they would sweeten it with tinned condensed milk. Then they used the condensed milk in the Caribbean, tinned, because fresh milk, if they didn't have any refrigeration, would go off pretty quickly. So I could resonate with Hans Sloane saying that this is a really bitter tea and the addition of sweetness. What Hans Sloane also documented at the time that is not really talked about, but I talk about it a lot now, more people are trying to do research around it, so he published 2 volumes on the natural history of Jamaica, but he also published, I think it's up to 3 or 4 volumes around just the enslavement of the Africans in Jamaica. And there he talks about how they were enslaved. He also collected enslaved artefacts which were displayed in the coffee houses of London, where the gentlemen used to frequent and do business in terms of trading these plant specimens, but also trading and enslavement of human beings. So I talk about this story so that people realise that there is more than one, like the phrase, there are 2 sides to every story. There's more than one side. And I have been accused by talking about these things that I'm trying to erase history. I have never said that publicly. You can listen to all the other things that I've published. What it is about is to put another side to the story, to give a more holistic approach, and also to understand and acknowledge the context and how these specimens were collected, when there was a lot of violence going on as well, where European natural historians could come and so-called collect, but actually the labour of collecting was by those enslaved or indigenous people, and that also has to be acknowledged. And a lot of the time that information is missing, sometimes on purpose, I found, and sometimes you've got to dig a bit deeper about it, because people that look like me have contributed historically, and we are benefiting from it ultimately. So this is the gilded canopy. So this is when you go into the main hall, the Hinsey Hall of the museum, and you look up, there are 162 botanical ceiling panels. It's been known as the gilded canopy since 2004, 2005, when 2 of my colleagues, Sandy Knapp and Bob Press, he's retired, but Sandy's still at the museum, she's a senior botanist. They were writing in terms of their scientific perspective about these plants. But this feeling does portray what was going on then as the museum was being built, all the trading. It's showing the wealth of the British Empire. So the theme shows citrus fruits, aloe plants, you name it, and they all have been collected in a colonial context, published by Western naturalists, and talking about being a failed chemist earlier on. But you know, all of these plants, the chemicals from these plants, derivatives from these plants, are now used in the pharmaceutical industry in every which way. Now, one theme panel again resonated with me, and this is Quassia amara. And I find it really interesting, so I've tried to track how this plant has been used in the pharmaceutical industry. Very, very interesting, but I've only got up to the 1950s. And it's very, very difficult, but still interesting at the time, at this point in time. And the reason why I find it interesting, because Carl Linnaeus, the godfather, the grandfather of classification, Swedish botanist, but also you know, his popularised classification system we still use today, and that's a whole other conversation as well about classifying things and names that we use. But what is really interesting is that he named that plant after this chap here, Graman Quasi or Quasi. So Graman, as a child, was enslaved and taken from Ghana and grew up in Suriname. And in the mid-1700s, Suriname was a Dutch colony. Graman gained and got all the knowledge in terms of using the plants medicinally from those indigenous people there. But he is a slightly controversial figure to Surinese people because he not only used that plant, Quasi amara, to again deal with fever and sickness and purge intestinal parasites of the enslaved and local people, but he also used his practice to cure illness of the Dutch colonialists. And for that, he got his right ear cut off, and also because he fought alongside the Dutch colonialists against the local Maroons in Suriname. So to Surinese people and their heritage, this guy is not a good guy. But, so see, I'm telling you that side of the story, so I'm telling you the bad as well as the good here, but I find it really interesting in terms of naming a species after a man of colour, and him being able, because it's documented, oh gosh, now I can't remember the books by Steedman and Blake, but I might remember later. But he is documented, I've lost my train of thought by saying that. Where was I going with this? Fought against the local Maroons. I've lost it completely. But anyway, so it is documented, yes. That's the reason why he's dressed in all this regalia is because he lived through a grand old age and he was actually honoured and recognised in The Hague for helping the Dutch colonialists. So you can see him in his coat, hat, tails, and so forth there. The reason why the Carl Linnaeus named the plant after him was because Carl Linnaeus sent his student Daniel Rolander to Suriname. He had a friend who owned a plantation and slaves again, a chap called Carl Gustav, and so Carl Linnaeus wanted some new specimens of plants to be transferred back to him, and his student Daniel bought the recipe from Gourmand Quasi and some samples of the plant. That's how it came back into the hands of Carl Linnaeus for him to, and Carl Linnaeus is documenting of praising, documented and praising Gourmand Quasi of being quite an intelligent man in terms of this medicinal properties of that plant. But as I say, the rest is history there. But it's quite a complicated history as well. So I'm just giving you a flavour of it. Now, this story in terms of John Edmiston and Charles Darwin is going to be in a book that's going to be published next year by someone else who's been working with me. And most of us might think of Charles Darwin as this old grey-haired, grey-bearded man, you know, origins of species, evolution, all those things, Darwin's finches. But little did we know that when he was the age of 16, 17, he was in Edinburgh, supposed to be studying medicine, didn't quite like that. And went through the more zoological, natural history route. And while he was there, he met this man, John Edmiston, who we have no photographs or proper illustrations, so this is somebody's idea of what John Edmiston might have looked like. But Charles Darwin met John Edmiston because John was teaching taxidermy to students there, which is really interesting. So John's background, he was enslaved in Guyana, worked on sugar plantations there. His owner at the time was, so that would have been the late 1700s, early 1800s. His owner at the time was a chap called Charles Edmiston, and so there by the surname you can see in terms of enslavement that John had lost his own identity, didn't have his his actual surname at that point in time, and that was popular. That's why I said the story of the Gourmand Quasi is quite interesting, keeping the African context of its name. John travelled with Charles Edmiston to the UK and then somehow got his freedom and then went to Edinburgh. He married a shop owner, I think her name was Mary, up there. I mean, all of this will come out in the book. There's still some things that we're not quite sure about. We've been through parish records and so forth. But you know, he became known as the university's taxidermist. And one can only imagine, well, I think that John would have been the first black person, or black man, that young Charles Darwin, teenage Charles Darwin, would have met. And you can only imagine the stories that were told why they were stuffing birds, doing taxidermy, of John telling him about his enslavement in Guyana, about his journey to the UK as well. Before Charles Darwin, in his early 20s, I think it was 1831 to 1834, Charles Darwin went on the ship called the Beagle on the voyage, what is well known now, to the Galapagos Islands, to Cocos Keeling Islands and so forth there. And the reason why I think that this was such an instrumental meeting of minds is because in Charles Darwin's autobiography that was published after his death, he didn't get to finish it, his son Francis published it, but it does talk about this, about him meeting John early on in his teenage years. So you sort of think, you've had a whole lifetime and you still remember that black man that you meet, and he does acknowledge, I think he calls him, the most intelligent black man that he'd met at that time, or something like that. There is a quote, and again, it escapes my mind, but I find this whole thing like really, really interesting there. Another person that I have been acknowledging their work and their knowledge here is Ali Wallace. Now, it's great, we've got a picture of Ali, and that's only because Alfred Russel Wallace, well known for his and the controversy that Darwin might have stolen his theories on evolution, and in the last 10 years at least, it's, you know, they've got equal acknowledgement in terms of that. But Alfred Russel Wallace, well known for collecting birds and some insects. We've got his large bird collection at the museum, and I say his in inverted commas, because Alfred Russel Wallace in his autobiography does talk about his working relationship with this teenage boy. In 1855, I think Ali was about 15, he became the favourite local guide in Malaysia of Alfred Russel Wallace. And Wallace says that when Ali was sick, he would look after him, and when Alfred Russel Wallace was sick, Ali would look after him. And he acknowledges Ali's knowledge in Malaysia and collection of birds. What hasn't happened over all that time since the birds were collected in terms of the Natural History Museum, so we've got our bird museum at Tring in Hertfordshire. It's known as the Alfred Russel Wallace Bird Collection. So what is happening now is to find those birds and fully acknowledge Ali Wallace in terms of his collection of birds and his indigenous knowledge of Malaysia at that point in time. So what's the link between spiny lobsters, I won't get you to all call out, spiny lobsters, corals and dinosaurs. So this is another way of looking at collections, because I work with them all the time, so I'm seeing things across many areas. And it wasn't until the midway in the pandemic, because I was still able to go and check that the storage and everything was correct in the specimens while a lot of my colleagues were at home. So I was able to work in the story on my own, and then I had a eureka moment. So the spiny lobsters there, you can see that are in that glass jar. They're collected in Kenya by Dr. Leakey. Now, I know of the Leakeys in terms of anthropology and Africa, and then there is a coral collected by William E. Cutler in 1924, and it says British East Africa on there, the expedition. And then I thought I did some searching and some other things in the collections, looking at other labels. And then I managed to find this, I'm not even sure how I managed to find this, but obviously partly through Google. But this is Louis Leakey. I think he was in his 20s at this time, so it might have been his first expedition. So he went on the British Museum East Africa expedition, where those items I just showed you were collected. And this was an expedition looking for dinosaurs and using indigenous labour in East Africa looking for dinosaurs. So in this paper, it's only 4 pages, but it has a lot of really interesting information. There's a picture of a tribe who did the collecting, but the lobsters and the coral were collected in a past time. So I was sort of thinking, well, when you collect dinosaurs, it's not in the middle of the ocean. So how come we've got lobsters? But often when people were going on an expedition, they had one main cause, what they were looking for, but during the past time they'd wander off and collect a lot of other things. So I'm using this information to pull together through our collections database to unite the different collections across the site, the dinosaur bones that were collected there, and the lobsters and the corals, and also to acknowledge the indigenous labour of collections as well, so that goes across the site, and so that people can search this information also from the front end of our database, because a lot of the information is put into the notes field that can only be searched internally and not externally. So, as I said earlier, specimen or object or both. So these are 2 lots of specimens because they're in my coral collection. There is a jug and a broken bottle with corals encrusting on them. Maybe if they were presented and displayed at the V&A as a jug and a bottle, they become objects. But it's really interesting, and when you're doing this kind of research, what to look for, to not just look for things that identify or written as objects, but things as specimens as well. That word is really important, and then to delve into the details. But here, these are both interesting because the broken bottle was purchased at the 1886 Indian and Colonial Exhibition that was held, so it was like a international trade fair that was held in South Kensington, and 4 million people visited there. I have found, oh no, it's not on this. I have found documents in online and antiques websites and so forth about this, and actually a brochure at the Wellcome Collection that explains all of this. And I also did find that Open University did a unit about this, course unit about this exhibition. But I'm still doing a lot more research about this, but one thing to say is that the catalogues give environmental information about, so this was collected in the Bahamas, but there were lots of, it was a trade fair, lots of other countries exhibiting, not only specimens and objects, but also people, indigenous people that came over as well, that were used as spectacle, which is not so great. So this has an interesting colonial history there. And then the jug on the other side was dived up in a place called Port Royal in the 1860s in Jamaica. And again, that was a place of turmoil, a lot of pirates, and a lot of not so pleasant things happening to people in Jamaica at that time. And I'm still doing research into 2 of those there, and also trying to find out what this jug might have been used for and what metal it is. I've been told it's pewter, but these are some of the things to look at when I'm thinking about what does it mean to decolonise natural history. It's like looking at these other stories and histories. So what do we need to recognise? So another aspect of, let's say, decolonising these institutions is around discovery and power. Who has been documented as discovering? Well, some of those stories that I've just told are those the naturalists, the Western naturalists originally, and I'm now pulling out, teasing out those stories of those indigenous black and brown people that have also collected and discovered, literally, they had discovered, they knew how to use these plants for medicinal purposes. So, you know, we can have that debate about discovery, what does it mean? There's also about power within museums, power dynamics, power in terms of labelling collections, power dynamics in terms of the hierarchy and what information is told about the specimens in the public arena, in the galleries, and also behind the scenes of how people work. So I've been doing a lot of work around, you know, how do I work with my colleagues? How do I make this kind of thinking part of their process? How do I make it easy? Because we're all pushed for time. But I was seeing all these things while I was doing my daily work. For me personally, it wasn't mature. It was just sort of things I'm thinking, well, that matches with that. That makes sense. People ought to know about it. When people visit museums, we have a lot of tourists in South Coast come to visit museums. It's international. It's an international audience. I want people who look like me and others to see themselves in the collections, to know about their cultural heritage and history, to see that it's all our histories. So it's something in terms of diversity, representation, you know, where is it? Where does it lie? I will tell you that I am, and I still can't believe it myself after 30 odd years, I am the only and longest serving black female natural history curator in the UK. Only, she hasn't started yet, but only 3 weeks ago there was an announcement that we're going to have, and she's relatively younger than me, but a black female curator of mineralogy, Nadine, that she announced it herself on Twitter. But you know, it's taken that long. I shouldn't even have to be standing to say, you know, a black curator. It should just be lots of individuals. And you know, when you have people with extra cultural insights, then they can work with those collections as well. And it's great for business, for museums and the industry in general, to bring their whole selves to their professional job, not just like, well, how do you preserve something in a particular chemical? How do you label it? It's like the stories that we share. I explained this a little bit, you know, whose name collection is it really? So I care for, and I know the slides are here, so the dissected parts of barnacles are here at the Zoology Museum in Cambridge, but I have and look after the whole specimens of what is known as Darwin's barnacles. He didn't collect any of them. He collected one barnacle, which is in not great condition. It's mounted on a slide over at the Zoological Museum there, but the whole specimens here were collected by other indigenous people and transferred by the network that Charles Darwin had of naturalists from all over the world. In fact, what you're looking at here are specimens collected on an expedition from a bird collector, which is really interesting. So not necessarily what people are known for, that they also collected other things. So reclaim the knowledge and all the objects. We're going to talk about reclaiming and repatriation of human remains, which exist in natural history collections. Only just this weekend, my museum has been in the media in terms of some communities in Zimbabwe looking for 2 chiefs, which don't seem to be at our museum, but a British museum is also involved and others. But that's an ongoing conversation about human remains. Here is about you know, valuing someone else's knowledge. So I met Sammy, you can see here it says Sammy Ponzig, who in 2016 found HMS Terror, lost in 1848. And so in terms of Sammy, in his community, he's of Inuit heritage, and so the oral history being passed down from generations with storytelling is of value in their community. And they, through that storytelling, would document with one another the environmental change. And what was happening was that the ice was melting, and he was told by his grandfather and father that over time that they thought they were seeing the wooden masts of this ship, and subsequently it was true. So it's all about, you know, what do you value? Is it just the academic written word? And some of those stories that I told you, I'm well aware that I'm telling you from you know, a Western perspective, because the letters are written by people, Western, some of the people of colour are not able to read or write, so I couldn't tell their story, but they would tell it through oral histories that may be lost in certain communities. So it's all those kind of things to think about. you know, what do we value, whose knowledge do we value, and perspectives. There are other industries that are looking at what museums are doing, in particular what I'm doing. So I was completely flabbergasted when in February this year I was invited over to Helsinki in Finland in May to a ballet directors conference where they were going to be discussing, or they did discuss, things along the lines of cultural appropriation. Whether, you know, you can see Swan Lake there, that there is no diversity in ballerinas there, or very little, but there are no people of colour. So I was there to talk about my work and to then start the discussion in their area of work, you know, about having more diversity of dancers, whether in Swan Lake that you could have flesh-coloured tights instead of the white tights if you had someone like me, about body shape and form, and about the narratives that some of the traditional ballet stories that are told, whether they're still culturally appropriate now. So this is a conversation that's just started, and so, you know, you never know where your work can be applied. So let's reimagine the future of museums and galleries and collections. So what does that mean? So in 2018, I started a Black History tour. Did that myself, so the stories that I've told you there, I do that as a tour. It's not embedded within the institution. There are still some difficult conversations to be had around that. But I must say, only 2 weekends ago, they did a Black History Month family festival at the museum, and I was allowed to do 2 of my Black History tours as part of that, and it was well received because I've got some really long emails from some Black families that have visited. Some have been visiting for the last 30 years and never experienced anything like that, and some have just, you know, just came along for the event. But anyway, this is just a tweet from a secondary school teacher who was on my very first tour in 2018. And you can see it says, a brilliant tour exploring a different side to natural history that is often not talked about, and really made me think about the untold stories and the contributions that have been erased by colonialism. And the way that the museum is moving forward now is to integrate some of these perspectives and ways of thinking within current exhibitions. Now, our Broken Planet, how we got here and ways to fix it, actually closed in August. It's going to reopen in 2024 because we're moving it to a new gallery. But for me, I was really pleased about this because for the first time, it took a decolonial perspective to this exhibition. It had a variety of quotes from a diverse community across the museum, and this one in particular resonated with me because it showed the sugar cane. So the colonial links here about enslavement as well as the sugar crops and all what is now in terms of the economy and sugar and sweeteners and everything. And my colleague Anna Claudia, you can see in the picture there a quote from her. She's a botanist of Caribbean heritage, and the museum has shown some of their books from our special collections. So the smaller book in your top right hand corner, that actually does depict enslavement within a Brazilian sugar refinery with a colonial hunter with a gun there, and people who were enslaved that are refining the sugar. So it's the museum, as you can see the title there on the interpretation, says the real price of sugar. So it's kind of like the first time that the museum is facing up to these histories and informing people that there are many other people's histories that have been left out. So we've just got to think about the communities that we engage, that we work with. And Blastfest UK is a small community organisation that I work with that have science tents embedded in various Caribbean carnivals up and down the UK, Leeds, Manchester, London, and one other, I can't remember. But the tent is facilitated with people of colour that are scientists in various disciplines across science, to encourage those families of colour that visit, or indeed anyone who's visiting, but in particular for those young people there to see role models within science and within the museum sector there, to know that we are there and they could possibly have those roles too. I'm part of a climate change movement that amplifies black and brown voices. It's called Climate Reframe, and it was launched just as the pandemic was happening, so it didn't gain much traction, but there are 100 of us that not just work in museums, that are activists in terms of social justice and the environmental movement, journalists, all sorts, and we're looking to bring on board another 100 black and brown voices from the UK in particular, to because the climate change affects all of us, but not just me here. In particular, the impact is further afield in other countries, and you know, we need to speak up for them in terms of those voices. And I showed you this earlier, so that's one image of John Edmonston. But then there's another one. I don't know if anyone has been to the library around here and seen me, or not realised it was me. So this was an interesting challenge for me. But so I sat as John Edmonston holding a bird of paradise. It was interesting going to the prop shop. I learnt a lot about what gentlemen of that day would wear. So there's a lot of stuff underneath that, the apron, and learning how to do the tie and everything. But a real honour at the same time to be part of this Darwin in Conversation exhibition, which is on, I think, until early December. I can't, and hopefully you'll forgive me, the other gentleman's name there, but it's just really, but it's again associated to Darwin. It's, oh yes, it's a Nigerian, I think it's the only person of colour that answered a survey that Charles Darwin put out. But anyway, go to the library and find out the story, really interesting. And other people that are doing great things in the sector in many ways to amplify people of colour voices, hold museums to account, is Museum Detox. So I'm one of the co-founders, myself, Sarah Wajid, and about 6 other people kind of started this group in 2014, and it's expanded. There are 500 of us. You don't have to be a curator, it's just people of colour that work in various roles across the museum and cultural sector. And we're there as a support network as well, because often it's quite difficult of being one of the very few of your own heritage within these big institutions. And so we're there to support, to make sure that we keep up with our well-being and so forth, because some of these perspectives and pieces of information that I told you, I'm coming across other very kind of traumatic bits of information, so I have to make sure that you know, I process in the right way with that, not internalising things too much and having a good chat. And we also visit each other's collections behind the scenes as well, so it's really fun as well. I'm also part of this fellowship, well, it's ending next month, at the end of November. November starts tomorrow, I think. So this is Museums Lab. It's a fellowship that started a year ago, so we're the second cohort. And this is brilliant because it's funded by the German Ministry, the German Academic Exchange, and Western Cape University in Cape Town. It's a cultural knowledge exchange fellowship. So again, it's people, well, they took 28 people from across the African continent that work in cultural institutions, not just natural history, in art, people that work for UNESCO as well, and then, so 28 from across Africa, and then I think it was about 25 from across Europe, and I was one of them. In the UK is not a European one, I still was eligible. It's been really brilliant because we've been brought together, exchanges of ideas. What does a museum mean in the UK versus a museum in Africa? Various thoughts and processes, a lot of learning and unlearning as well. So I've unlearned certain things and learned a lot. So it's fantastic, and this cohort is, you know, going to change things. We've challenged the German government as well, and so we were all in Berlin in June and we were in Cape Town in September, but while I was in Berlin in June, I was lucky enough to witness signing of the declaration to send back the Benin bronzes, so there was an agreement signed between Germany and Nigeria there. And if you're looking for resources, even though it says supporting decolonisation in museums, I think it's something that everybody, no matter what industry or just you to familiarise yourself with what's going on. There's this document that I spent 2 years working on with the Museums Association and about 8 or 9 other people. And it not only giving guidance in terms of interpretation in museums, but questions and how to deal with the difficult conversations around this, diversity, representation, inclusion, employment of staff, just everything. And it is a living document. There's lots of great references to papers and online documents there.